For generations, authority over language has often belonged to institutions rooted in colonial history, and few names carry more weight than Oxford. When early scholars documented Filipino speech patterns, they did so through a narrow lens shaped by imperial assumptions. They observed Filipinos blending English with native languages and Spanish influences, then concluded this mixture represented failure rather than fluency. What they recorded was not curiosity but judgment, and those judgments were preserved in respected references that shaped global opinion. Over time, these descriptions hardened into accepted truths, framing Filipino English as incomplete, informal, or flawed. This characterization did not remain confined to academic circles. It traveled into classrooms, workplaces, and immigration offices, influencing how Filipinos were treated both at home and abroad. Young students absorbed the idea that their natural way of speaking was something to correct or hide. Overseas workers learned that accents could invite ridicule or doubt. What began as academic arrogance quietly became a social burden carried by millions who were told, directly or indirectly, that their voice lacked legitimacy. Yet beneath this imposed shame, something far more powerful was developing, unnoticed by those who believed the story was already written. Language, however, does not exist in dictionaries alone. It lives where people use it, and in the Philippines it continued to grow in homes, streets, schools, and workplaces. Filipino speakers moved fluidly between languages because their history demanded adaptability. Trade, migration, and survival required communication across cultures, and flexibility became a strength rather than a weakness. While textbooks described Filipino English as damaged, everyday reality told a different story. Filipinos communicated complex ideas, emotions, and negotiations across borders with ease. They adjusted tone instinctively, blending warmth with clarity, humor with precision. This ability did not emerge despite linguistic blending, but because of it. Still, the global narrative lagged behind lived experience. The same references that dismissed Filipino speech were cited by educators and employers who never questioned their assumptions. As a result, Filipinos often felt pressured to imitate foreign standards rather than refine their own voice. Yet quietly, a generation was learning that communication is not about purity, but effectiveness. Every conversation held across cultures, every misunderstanding resolved, every relationship built through language was slowly undermining the old judgment. The contradiction between reputation and reality was growing, and eventually it would demand to be confronted. One of the clearest challenges to the old narrative emerged not in universities, but in the global workforce. As international companies expanded, they turned to the Philippines for customer support, technical assistance, and communication-heavy roles. Executives initially expected efficiency at low cost, not excellence in language. What they encountered surprised them. Filipino workers handled complex conversations with empathy and precision, often outperforming counterparts from countries traditionally associated with standard English. Customers noticed not just understanding, but connection. Problems were explained clearly, frustrations eased patiently, and trust built quickly. Accents that once drew mockery became familiar and even comforting. Feedback data reflected higher satisfaction rates, and companies responded by expanding operations further. Yet the irony remained. The same linguistic flexibility that enabled success was still labeled inferior in academic references. Filipino English worked in practice, but lacked recognition in theory. This gap revealed a deeper issue. Institutions were measuring language by appearance rather than function. The world was relying on Filipino voices daily while continuing to doubt their legitimacy. That contradiction could not last forever, because success has a way of demanding acknowledgement, even from the most established authorities. Beyond corporate settings, Filipino speakers were also redefining expectations in academic and intellectual arenas. International debate competitions, research conferences, and scholarly exchanges increasingly featured Filipinos who spoke with confidence and clarity. Judges and peers focused on logic, insight, and persuasion, not accent. Arguments delivered by Filipinos were frequently praised for nuance and emotional intelligence, qualities shaped by navigating multilingual environments. Code switching, once dismissed as confusion, proved to be cognitive agility. Speakers shifted registers seamlessly, tailoring language to audience and context. This adaptability, far from being a flaw, became an advantage in global discourse. Meanwhile, linguists outside traditional Western centers began questioning inherited classifications. They observed that Filipino English followed consistent grammatical patterns and pragmatic rules, meeting every criterion of a legitimate language variety. Research papers quietly accumulated, challenging older definitions without public confrontation. The foundation of the old judgment was eroding, even if Oxford had not yet acknowledged it. Language evolves faster than institutions, and the evidence was mounting. The only thing missing was a moment powerful enough to force recognition, a setting where authority and reality would collide openly and undeniably. That moment arrived within Oxford's own walls during an international linguistic conference intended to explore language evolution in the modern world. Scholars gathered expecting familiar debates framed by established hierarchies. When a Filipino linguist was scheduled to speak, interest was polite but limited. Few anticipated disruption. Yet from the moment he approached the podium, it was clear this presentation would not follow expectations. He did not position himself defensively, nor did he seek validation. Instead, he began by reframing the discussion itself. Language, he argued, is not a museum artifact preserved in glass, but a living system shaped by human experience. He spoke in precise English, establishing credibility on the very terms often used to exclude. Then deliberately, he expanded beyond those terms. His delivery carried calm authority, inviting listeners to follow rather than resist. This was not an emotional appeal, but an intellectual challenge. By grounding his argument in linguistic theory and lived reality, he set the stage for something Oxford had rarely experienced: being asked to listen rather than define. As the presentation unfolded, the Filipino scholar demonstrated what theory alone could not. He shifted seamlessly between English, Filipino, Spanish, and Taglish, not as performance, but as evidence. Each transition served a purpose, illustrating how meaning can deepen rather than fracture through blending. He explained how historical forces shaped Filipino speech, from trade routes to colonization to migration. Instead of apologizing for hybridity, he presented it as proof of resilience. Languages that survive pressure, he argued, do so by adapting, not by remaining pure. The audience began to change. Pens moved faster, expressions sharpened. What had been dismissed as broken was now framed as evolved. Scholars recognized patterns they could no longer ignore. This was not chaos, but structure they had failed to see. The presentation challenged not only definitions, but authority itself. Oxford's historical stance suddenly appeared narrow, even outdated. Without confrontation or accusation, the Filipino speaker had shifted the burden of proof. The institution known for defining language was now being asked to justify its past judgments. When the presentation concluded, the response was immediate and unmistakable. Applause filled the hall, not out of courtesy, but recognition. Questions followed, probing deeper into Filipino English as a legitimate variety rather than an anomaly. The tone of the discussion had changed. No one asked whether the language was valid anymore. Instead, they asked why it had taken so long to acknowledge it. In academic circles, such shifts are rare and consequential. What happened that day did not erase history, but it disrupted its authority. The scholars' arguments circulated quickly beyond the conference. Clips, transcripts, and analyses spread through academic networks, social media, and news outlets. For many Filipinos, this moment carried emotional weight. It was not simply about recognition from Oxford, but about reclaiming dignity long denied. The words they grew up doubting were now defended at the highest level. Language, once a source of shame, was reframed as inheritance. The impact extended beyond linguistics, touching identity, confidence, and belonging on a global stage. Institutional change rarely happens overnight, but momentum had begun. Linguistic publications revisited older classifications, updating language around Filipino English. Educators incorporated new perspectives into curricula, teaching students that variation does not equal error. International organizations became more cautious about equating accent with competence. These shifts may have seemed subtle, but for millions of Filipinos, they mattered deeply. Recognition validated experiences long dismissed. It also challenged other institutions to examine their own assumptions. If Filipino English could be misjudged for decades, what else had been overlooked? The conversation expanded beyond one language to the broader issue of whose voices are considered authoritative. Power, it became clear, had shaped definitions more than evidence. By confronting this imbalance, the Filipino scholars' intervention encouraged a more inclusive understanding of language worldwide. The legacy of that moment was not limited to policy updates or academic footnotes. It changed how people listened, and listening, after all, is the foundation of understanding. For Filipinos abroad, the impact was immediate and personal. Workers who once softened their accents or avoided speaking up began to feel less pressure to conform. Students participated more confidently in discussions, no longer viewing their speech as something to fix. This shift in self-perception altered interactions subtly but powerfully. Confidence affects clarity, and clarity affects how ideas are received. As Filipino voices grew more assured, they became harder to dismiss. This was not about superiority, but equality. Language ceased to be a barrier and became a bridge. Importantly, the recognition also encouraged preservation of linguistic diversity within the Philippines itself. Regional languages and code-switching practices gained renewed respect, understood as part of a broader adaptive tradition. The narrative had changed from deficiency to dynamism. What Oxford once labeled broken was now recognized as evidence of historical depth and cultural intelligence. The insult had lost its power because it had been exposed as misunderstanding. Looking back, The episode revealed how easily authority can mistake familiarity for correctness. Oxford's earlier classification was not born of malice alone, but of limited perspective. Yet impact matters more than intent. Generations lived under the weight of that judgment. What changed was not the language itself, but who was allowed to speak about it. When Filipinos claimed space in scholarly discourse, the conversation shifted. This pattern echoes across history. Marginalized voices often need to demonstrate excellence twice over to be heard once. The Filipino experience with language is a case study in how resilience operates quietly until it becomes undeniable. Adaptation, often mocked, turns out to be survival refined into skill. The truth that emerged was simple but profound. Languages evolve because people do, and people adapt because they must. The reassessment of Filipino English also influenced global conversations about education and assessment. Standardized testing systems began to reconsider rigid benchmarks that penalized variation. Linguists emphasized communicative competence over imitation of a single norm. These changes did not lower standards. They refined them. Understanding became more important than accent. Meaning mattered more than mimicry. This shift benefited not only Filipinos, but speakers of many world Englishes. By challenging one outdated classification, a broader transformation began. Diversity in language was no longer treated as a problem to solve, but a reality to understand. The Filipino case provided both evidence and inspiration for this shift. Within the Philippines, the moment sparked renewed pride in linguistic identity. Educators encouraged students to master English without rejecting their own speech patterns. Media celebrated code switching as creativity rather than error. Artists, writers, and speakers embraced linguistic blending as authentic expression. This cultural confidence reinforced academic arguments, creating a cycle of validation. Language thrives when speakers feel ownership. The old shame gradually faded, replaced by curiosity and confidence. The narrative was no longer about catching up, but contributing something unique to global discourse. Oxford, for its part, did not issue dramatic apologies or declarations. Institutions rarely do. Instead, it adjusted. Definitions evolved, classifications softened, references updated. These quiet changes signaled something important: acknowledgement without defensiveness. The authority remained, but it was no longer unquestioned. That, perhaps, was the most significant outcome. Power listened, adapted, and moved forward. The relationship between institution and speaker shifted from hierarchy to dialogue. Filipino English did not need permission to exist, but recognition mattered nonetheless. The story's significance extends beyond language. It illustrates how marginalized perspectives can reshape global understanding when given space. It also serves as a reminder that expertise must remain open to correction. Knowledge stagnates when insulated from lived experience. Filipino voices, long dismissed, demonstrated that insight often emerges from adaptation rather than privilege. Their journey from mockery to recognition underscores a broader truth. Resilience, when articulated clearly, becomes authority in its own right. In the end, Oxford did not simply revise a definition. It encountered a reality it could no longer deny. Filipino English emerged not as a deviation, but as evidence of language's capacity to survive, adapt, and connect across histories. What was once labeled broken proved to be whole, dynamic, and deeply human. The insult lost its force because the truth spoke louder, and once heard, it could not be unheard.